Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Jo Moyer. I'm back in Auckland with Tim Murphy. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Jo. Hi, Mark.
And yes, Mark. Hello. Mark Jordan.
Hello, both of you.
Today we're going to break down the latest polls, there have been a few, and throw forward to what the next government might look like. And to wrap up, rather than recommendations, we're going to spice it up. This week we've got a couple of campaign quickfires. Right, first, polls, 3 of them, all in one day in fact. We must be close to an election or something, are we? Mark, let's get you to do the job that I hate. Wrap up a little bit for us what the polls said, please.
Yeah, so on Wednesday we had 3 polls, one from each of the TV news stations and then one from The Guardian done by the pollster Essential. They're pretty new here, so theirs landed early on Wednesday morning. It showed Labour up 3, I believe, from where they had been in the previous month's poll, and certainly, you know, a big surprise for Labour to be rising. New Zealand First still in that kingmaker position, around 8% for New Zealand First, which would be, you know, quite a huge jump from where polls have shown them previously. The TV polls later that evening kind of confirmed some of the trends, if not the exact numbers of that Guardian poll. Labour up a bit. National had a different result in each of the TV polls. So One News had them up 1 point, whereas News Hub had them down 4. And so that's sort of a bit of a question mark there about exactly what's going on there. And New Zealand First still in the kingmaker position, as with basically every poll we've had for the past few weeks now.
Yeah, about 6% in both of those polls, both of the TV polls on Wednesday night for New Zealand First. So definitely over that sort of hanging around the just under 5 or just over, cracking into that definitely 6.2, I think were the 2 results there. Tim, obviously we're getting very, very close to crunch night. Who should be worried and who shouldn't be worried about these polls? How's it all sort of playing out, do you think?
I think both big parties should be worried. If they'd been sitting in their strategy rooms, say, 3 months ago, and for Labour, they would imagine themselves being happy to go up a couple of points to 27.9 or 28, it'd be despair. That they wouldn't have been able to believe that this is where they'd end up at. National as well. Even on the better of the polls on Wednesday night, National was at 37. 37 is just, it's not a good number. And while Jacinda Ardern won with 37 by putting herself together with Winston Peters, and we saw what happened in that government, and that's the same scenario now where an average big party performance with a reasonable performance by New Zealand First can get a party across the line. So I think the big parties really, it's a bit of a pattern, a trend of this whole campaign has been how poorly the 2 of them have gone.
I think too, Mark, and obviously you've been charting these polls along the way with the exceptional resource you've got there on newsroom.co.nz. Just plug that one more time. The narrowing that we're seeing, you know, between that left block and the right block, and sort of New Zealand First picking up some of that vote, it's probably worth pointing out, though, isn't it, that when you have these polls come out, they seem to be grouping the left being Labour, Greens Te Pāti Māori, and the right being National and ACT. But in reality, I mean, Winston Peters has made it clear, Chris Hipkins has made it clear, New Zealand First is in play in the right block. So if you put those numbers together, I mean, the centre-right block absolutely has the numbers right. But what have you sort of made, I guess, of the sort of coming together of the 2 blocks as it has been over the last few weeks?
Yeah, even with New Zealand First included in that right block, the gap between them has been narrowing from maybe around 5% overall down to 2% in the most recent polls from Wednesday. You know, that's still a lot of people, a lot of voters to win over. But it shows that there's wiggle room here. I don't think it's as sure of a thing as it looked, say, 3 weeks ago when. When you know Winston Peters was on or around 5% and National and ACT were still polling in a way that they could govern together, you know, without needing him.
Yeah, I mean, like you said before, Tim, obviously National hit or got close to 40 in a couple of polls and would have assumed that momentum would have continued, and all it's done is sort of drop away. Let's talk about Winston Peters, though. He seems to have timed his little run here quite perfectly, some might say, actually. Thoughts?
Well, yeah, he has, and you'd have to say that it's been a very measured campaign for him. I think they were going okay before Luxon's, weird initiative to sort of say that they'd pick up the phone to him. They were still then poised, and I think the momentum for New Zealand First, he'd managed to get himself in the media enough, he'd managed to get himself into the kind of the discussion, the political whole sort of world was welcoming him back already. So I think they would have got there. I think they would still have been in just around that 5 and getting close, as we've talked about before, with the added on causes this time from various anti-this and anti-that that have latched on to him. I think they probably would have got there. So you'd have to say that while the result might not be what more than 7% or 8% of people want, that he's got to that pivotal point well. Boosted again, as we've talked in the past, by the national initiative, not harmed by Labour saying we don't want to work with you. That hasn't had a blind bit of difference. You'd say that their polling is... He'd say it's exactly what they always thought, and their polls have been showing this for a long time. But it's a pretty good result.
Yeah, I mean that sort of social media video, which was highly produced, pretty polished one. We've talked about it before here on Raw Politics. Interesting though, Mark, like crunching the numbers around what the 5 polls before September the 25th, which is when that video was released by Christopher Luxon, versus the 5 polls after that video, and how that New Zealand First average polling has shifted from before to after. 5.2% they were averaging. After September the 25th and that video dropping, they were up to 6.7. Now, you've had the National Party campaign chair, Chris Bishop, say, it's got absolutely nothing to do with that video. But I will continue to argue that the messaging became so confused and gave Winston Peters so much oxygen and so much airtime. It also created a scenario where you had Christopher Luxon and Chris Bishop in particular having to really push back and start severely backpedaling on what sort of a message it was that they had intended to send versus how it was actually received. But not only did you have them talking about Winston Peters all of the time, you've also, in the last few weeks, had Chris Hipkins talking about Winston Peters constantly, because he's seen it as an opportunity to say, hey, already got the t-shirt from having worked with that guy, don't want it again, it was rubbish. And all you've had since is a big Winston Peters talk fest and absolutely nothing else. Mark, just bringing you back in here, Chris Hipkins, he has been talking for the last, probably about 10 days now about the fact that they've got momentum, or it's kind of mini-mentum, isn't it, to steal a Claire Trevette line. And it does seem that that kind of came through a little bit in the polls. What have you made of, I guess, that chippy surge, if we want to call it that?
Yeah, it's it's not the sort of scale of the surge that you might want. And it's maybe a bit late in the piece, given that we're only a handful of days out from Election Day. But yeah, the polls are starting to show that. Grant Robertson, I asked him about this as well after the finance debate in Wellington on Monday. He said, yep, we're turning it around. Hipkins, the day he came out of isolation and did a tour around Wellington, that was his big message, alongside the Nats tax plan having this hole or that hole. And James Shaw as well, I asked on Wednesday, what do the Greens' internal polls show? And he said, yeah, there's a slight uptick there for Labour in what they're seeing as well. And that was then backed up by those polls on Wednesday night. So, I think the turnaround is real. You can ask whether it's a turnaround because of what Labour's doing versus whether people are fleeing national with all of the talk of a second election and the Winston Peters chaos and that sort of thing. But definitely it's starting to turn. Just the question is it soon enough and fast enough? Tim, you had some thoughts on that.
Oh, just one quick point. I asked Hipkins last Saturday what precedent he had for a party that was 8 points behind as it was then, behind that main rival, to be able to overturn that in a week. And he comes back with, the last election, 2020, the difference between the final polls and the election night was 10 points, that Labour then went up by 4 point something and National went down by 5 point something, which is true, but it's not representative of what we're talking about, because in that case, the loser party, National, went down a heap and the leading party of the two went up well. In this case, that would be National going up a lot better and Labour. Now, they don't always follow uniformly, but it's a slightly misrepresentative portrayal of the task ahead of them. It's not the same as that.
Oh, well, if the shoe fits or doesn't in this case.
I guess there's a thing there of polls not always being spot on, but also particularly compared to last time, more people are going to be making their decision on election day. They're going to have had this week or week plus of the New Zealand first sort of panic alarm in their ears and in their minds. And so will they actually maybe make a different decision when they're standing there in the box thinking about it than they might have told a pollster a few days ago? That's Chippy's hope.
Now let's examine what the shape of the next government might look like and how long it might actually take to get there. We have a by-election coming up, Mark. November the 25th for Port Waikato. Obviously, sadly, the ACT candidate in that seat, Neil Christensen, passed away. And now there is going to be a party vote collected at the general election in that seat. But the electorate vote will be determined on November the 25th in a by-election. All sorts of things now kind of happen as a result of that. Talk us through a little bit, Mark. How do you think that this is going to affect, I guess, whether people turn out and vote? I would suspect that some parties would be concerned that it might affect the party vote, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine turnout being a little bit depressed. It really depends on how well that message is put out there, that actually the party vote is still being counted and there's still a point to going to the polls. It's a bit of a kind of archaic technicality that we're seeing play out here. It seems like it's not something that people were really intending or thinking about all that much when they added MMP into the system and left this rule in there. I think it's supposed to be a first past the post sort of hangover for what happens if a candidate passes away during an election campaign. But what it means is Parliament is now going to have 121 seats to start with. There could be other overhangs like you normally get, but this, by definition, we get at least one of them. If Andrew Bailey, who's National's candidate in Port Waikato, makes it in at the general election off the list, and then he wins the seat, which is almost certain to happen, it's a really blue seat, it's always been blue, then the next candidate, the next person on the list, which could be from any party, would come into Parliament, but chances are it would be National based on current polling. If Bailey doesn't make it in off the list on election day, then he will almost certainly win the by-election. So probably it means there's an extra seat in there for National. I think it's something that probably the Parliament and parties of all stripes will take a look at after the election and when the House next sits to try and patch that up, because it seems to have had some unintended consequences. Grant Robertson and James Shaw, I spoke with both of them about it, and they're both quite politically adept people, Grant Robertson, leader of the House, and neither of them had been aware that this was a possibility prior to it actually sort of unfolding on Monday. So, a bit of a weird one to start things off.
Yeah, I think Nicola Willis made the comment in a press conference around the time that it all happened that it was a piece of electoral law she was learning about on the spot, because it's just one of these quirks that people didn't really know about. I mean, the other thing that comes into play as well is what that means for when a government might be formed, because the way the polls are looking at the moment, you're going to have Winston Peters in play, if they're correct, right? Now, we all know that Winston Peters likes to wait for special votes to be counted, just so you've got kind of the lay of the land. They come in, of course, a couple of weeks after the general election result. You've now got a by-election taking place on the November the 25th. Winston Peters could say, actually, I want to see what the result of that is before we sort of start to get into finalising any particular negotiations. Last day that the writ can be returned for that by-election, which would have taken into consideration whether there was any calls for judicial recounts, any of that sort of stuff, is December the 15th. You've got to have Parliament have met by December the 21st, because that is 6 weeks after the general election took place and the Governor-General requires that. Slight catch there is that you don't have to have a government. You can have your House of Representatives meet as a Parliament, while a caretaker government, which in this case would continue to be Prime Minister Chris Hipkins, carries on doing the caretaker thing, and you still have these government negotiations going on. Now, we've seen in other countries where negotiations have gone on for sort of 18 months, whatever. I would be incredibly surprised if Winston Peters was going to go down that track. But it is slightly alarming for those of us who work in Parliament in particular, that you could have a situation where Parliament meets on the 21st of December. It's only been 6 days since the sort of final Port Waikato result has come back, and negotiations aren't finalised, and we're all still sitting there going, well, who's it going to be?
But surely even Peters, who is a purist on these things, or says he is, that he needs to know exactly what the people have given him. But surely you could line up with the party that is most likely, which in terms of the Port Waikato by-election, and the result that Mark's outlined, that are most likely national gain, and have things almost all tidied up before that final date comes in on December 15, if you wait for that. So you wouldn't expect that you'd go beyond that December 15. By December 15, the result's out, even if you're being a sort of a holdout and a purist. By then, you should have had everything lined up and prepared and be ready to go, surely.
Yeah, I mean, what will be particularly crazy is if National and ACT got 60 seats after the specials came in and are requiring that one seat from Port Waikato to make it 61 to get their majority. But that's not really a very safe majority, right? So you kind of have to potentially be negotiating with Winston Peters in amongst all of that anyway.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in here, Joe, and let you know, because it's from what you're saying, it sounds like it's possible that we don't have a government until next year. I'm actually on leave from October 16 until about July 1st next year. So good luck with that. One other note that was worth making on the by-election thing is if Andrew Bailey gets in off the list on Saturday night, we actually will be able to tell who the next list seat will go to if he then wins that by-election from that point. So we won't need to wait until the by-election occurs to figure that one out. And so hopefully that would shorten the waiting period that you'll have to go through, Joe, alone in the gallery while I'm on vacation.
Well, I mean, Sam Suchdave is presumably watching / listening to this and is at the ready to return to the desk.
Joe, if we're making this assumption that the polls play out as they are and that Peters will be in play, if talks begin, who is he going to be facing? In that, in the past, he's had various old mates on the other side of the table. Way back in Bolger's day, when Peters took New Zealand first into coalition, he had people like Paul East and Don McKinnon, who were his old buddies, his former National Party buddies, and you'd see there'd be a good feeling beyond the straight-out policy and political. Under Labour, you have more familiar with this under Jacinda, who that would have been, under Clark, who that would have been. There are always people who he's able to get along with. If he's negotiating with Chris Luxon and Chris Bishop and David Seymour, even separately, who are the people who might feel they can reach out and kind of make it a more welcoming or warm relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I take your point about having had sort of warm, friendly people previously. Bear in mind, in 2017, there is a pretty good argument to be made that they took the wrong people into the room from Bill English National side. I mean, the fact that Stephen Joyce and Paula Bennett were in there, who Winston Peters had some issues with, I guess we could say, was an interesting decision. And at the time, when people were speculating who they thought might go into the room, the suggestion was made that they should throw in, for example, Mark Mitchell and Todd Muller, who had good relationships with Winston Peters and Shane Jones, but because they were backbench MPs, of course they didn't. So this is when it gets tricky, because do you take in your most senior sort of strategists, or do you bring in people who are going to kind of create a mood and a vibe in the room, so to speak? Because if you look at it, and as you say, we're very much jumping ahead here, but the people you would expect would be Christopher Luxon, Nicola Willis, Chris Bishop. Who else are we throwing in there?
From National?
Yeah.
Well, who else could be sort of able and friendly? I mean, you need someone there to warm it up. Those three are relatively cold in the way that you'd regard someone like Peters, I would have thought.
Yeah, and so then you go, okay, well, who's he friendly with? And conveniently, I spoke to Winston Peters at a Ponsonby Cafe this week and asked him this question. And, you know, the three people that he has a relationship with and says there's respect and all the rest of it is Jerry Brownlee, Mark Mitchell, and Todd McClay. So do you take those people in, or does that put Chris Bishop and Nicola Willis, you know, are their noses then out of joint because they're not around the table? It's a tricky one because, you know, you kind of, you want to have the people in there who are your sort of, you know, top team, your kitchen cabinet, but then do you potentially run the risk of annoying Winston?
Well, National's got to learn from last time. You know, they can't take the same approach in. Not that it's quite the contest it was from 2017. This time it should be a more one-horse discussion, but they can't play the same kind of strategy. They're going to have to shake it up a bit.
I mean, to be fair too, I asked Winston Peters about his relationship with Chris Bishop because it has never been good. You only need to go through Hansard to see the sort of jibes that have gone on between those two. Winston this week was playing down the fact that it's not a good relationship, but also making quite sort of patronising comments about Chris Bishop in terms of, oh, well, you know, he will learn. It will be a learning curve for him at the negotiating table, that sort of thing. To be honest, I think Winston Peters is just playing with them at this point.
Did you ask Peters one pertinent question? Because in 2017 it was something that no one knew. Has he actually filed any lawsuits against the National Party that we don't know about?
Well, I didn't want to run the risk that he might say to me, I've just got to pop out to the car and grab my briefcase and bring in a whole stack of them. And, you know, who knows who would have been in there. Your name might have popped up.
Back in 2017 it would have. But, you know, this is the thing. Last time he went into that in good faith, supposedly, but he was already had papers ready to be served on numerous national people. So, you know, it's not that again, but you never know. You've got to be very careful what might or might not be going on there.
Let's wrap things up with some campaign quickfires. First up, best play of the campaign. Tim, go.
For me, it's the Greens releasing their wealth tax early, costed, got themselves plenty of time to get that bedded in.
Mark?
For me, it's how Winston Peters has sort of navigated the chaos of the last few weeks in order to come out on top of both National and ACT, really.
And I'm going to go with Christopher Luxon using his extrovert nature incredibly well on the campaign trail. He has been very good out there amongst the people. Right, worst play. Mark, let's start with you.
My vote for worst play is how Chippy has sort of failed to fire in the first few weeks of the campaign, like we discussed on a previous episode.
Tim?
Mine is David Seymour and being drawn out by Radio New Zealand to say that he would give this next government with National only votes in support of supply or funding.
I am going to go with the National Party Christopher Luxon video ruling in Winston Peters, which went terribly. Mark and Tim, I believe you have a disagreement about worst play, best play.
Yeah, I was going to suggest one of the worst plays would have been National's tax policy and savings package, which has been relentlessly criticised throughout. Mark, I think your view is that, in fact, it didn't dent them and may have helped overall.
Yeah, I don't think they've really been hurt that much by the criticisms of it. I don't think Labour's managed to get those attacks to stick in the way they might have wanted. And I think a lot of people are still coming away with the impression, yeah, there's a little bit of argument about it this way or that way, but that's politics. The point is I get money in my pocket at the end of the day, which is the point that National wanted to get across.
Good to have some diversity of opinion here on Raw Politics. Okay, standout performer. Mark?
I thought James Shaw at the TV-NZ debate, the power brokers one he participated in, I think he won that debate and was sort of a standout performer from that perspective.
Tim?
Winston Peters' smile, it's got him a long way.
And I'm going to go a little bit outside of the box because I didn't specifically say a standout politician. So I'm going to give standout performer to TVNZ's Jack Tame. I think his leaders' interviews have been exceptional this campaign period, and he's got some really good news stories out of them and has just kind of really pushed all of the leaders hard.
I'm going to just jump in with a worse performer, and for me it's the centre-right rich list of donors. The fact that they've contributed so much money to all of these parties, and often multiple of the parties at once, has led to them all coming up in various ways or eating each other's lunch, and we're left with this cluster that we've now got to deal with.
I've got a vote for worst performer as well, and if he listens, I'll get a complaining WhatsApp message about it. But I think Chris Bishop, probably high hopes for him as a campaign chair going into this election, and kind of everything that's come out. It should have been Nationals to win. It may well still be, but not in the way that they would have thought 3 months ago.
Okay, well, this wasn't even meant to be on the list, so I don't have one, so let's just wrap it up there.
You're such a positive force, Jo.
Oh, yeah, very well known for that. That's it from Raw Politics for this week. Tim, I believe you have a few words to say.
Oh, only that this will be the penultimate episode of Raw Politics. For now, we'll be back next week to trawl through the election results and the government formation. But this was always an election period podcast. So we'll temporarily be taking a seat and watching from afar, but we expect to have our next season back early next year for the second election.
That is not depressing or alarming at all. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, who has put up with a lot, I can assure you, and our readers, listeners, and viewers. Please send any burning questions. There's only one last chance. You can send them to me, jo.moyer@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week, same time, same place, here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.